All right, we are live. Nobody's on just yet.
For now.
The topic is scaring everybody away. Welcome to those who are joining. Feel free to say hello in the chat. Hello, Louisa, Sud, Jeffrey McCarthy. That's a name I'm not familiar with. To meet you, Jeffrey, Bryce. Hello, Bryce. Hello, Suzanne, Yankee. We'll get started in another minute or so. Hello, Manel. All right, let's get started. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. All right, friends. So today's topic is why practice mindfulness of death? It's a fairly common thing that there's the view among many monastics that mindfulness of death practices are not really for lay people. And I, of course, completely disagree with this and have many years of mindfulness death practices as a layperson to counteract this view. And so I'll talk about different ways of doing mindfulness of death, but really this is about why. So this is going to be me kind of, at least in the beginning, making a case as to why you should start doing at least very basic mindfulness of death practices. Maybe you've heard of the term the divine messengers. The Buddha wants us to be able to see these. But normally what happens is, because we're unmindful, and we don't like to see them, well, we don't see them. They're out of our perception, both consciously and subconsciously. What are these three divine messengers? Well, if you're familiar with the most common story of how the Buddha went forth, then you know at least three of them. Right? That the Buddha saw an old person, a sick person, and a dead person. And then he saw a monk. So the Buddha says that we should see and understand and know very deeply, very well, these divine messengers of old age, sickness, and death. And it's quite clear why we should do this. In the sutta, the divine messengers, Devadutta Sutta, the Buddha gives a story of a person who does bad deeds, is unmindful, acting unskillful, and goes to the underworld, and goes in front of King Yama. And King Yama says, "Good sir, you have committed these unskillful deeds by body, speech, and mind. Did you not see the divine messengers?" The person's like, no. And so King Yama says, "Did you not see an old person?" "Oh, yeah, I did see that." "A sick person?" "Oh, yeah. A dead person?" "Oh, yeah, I saw those." So, this is a person who was around them, but they didn't really see them. They didn't really understand. They didn't really reflect on these things. And so in doing so, they kind of wasted their life. They lived unmindful, like zombies. Right? That's what the Buddha says. Mindfulness is close to the deathless. Mindlessness is close to death. Those who are mindful never die. Those who are mindless are as if dead already. So most of us are just zombies. We're just going through life. We don't pay attention to what's really important. What's really important? Well, first of all, the most important thing is that to understand that everything, sabbe sankhara anicca. Everything is unstable. Everything is undependable. Everything is impermanent. Yet we act as if we're going to live forever. Getting old, dying. That's yeah. Maybe I know that's going to happen, but that's in some far off future. Even when you're like 60, getting into 70, you might think, "Oh, yeah, that's like 20 years from now." Because we have this delusion that it's not really going to happen to us. Or if it will, it's far away. So I don't have to think about it. Why think about these things? Don't be so morbid. Who wants to think about this stuff all the time? These are actually quite common responses that I've gotten from not necessarily Buddhist people, but other just regular people out in the world when I've discussed things like old age and death. But it points to a very common mindset. I don't want to think about these things. I don't want to think about when my parents might die, or when my spouse might die, or when I might die, or when we have to get old and I might not be able to drive anymore. I might not be able to do this or that anymore like I used to. We don't want to think about these things, and so we don't. And as somebody who grew up around a lot of older people and a lot of death, I was able to see two kinds of people. There were people who grew old and just fell apart. They just became utterly miserable. And I saw people who grew old peacefully, happily, and joyfully. And I remember saying to myself as a young person, I want to be like them, like that second group. I don't want to grow old and fall apart. I don't want to come close to my death and fall apart. And this was many years before I was a Buddhist. But these are the things that, as somebody who saw a lot of divine messengers in my life growing up from a young age, these are things that I had the wisdom and the intuition to really reflect about, reflect and to contemplate and to investigate. That's probably because of practice in past lives. There's a lot of weirdness of me as a child that can only probably be explained by practice in past lives. But this is so very important to reflect on the realities of life, to reflect on the nature of existence. The nature of existence is that everything you experience is unstable, undependable. It has arisen for a time and it will cease. And so the Buddha, one of the common kind of things to see in Buddhist temples, but also Catholic churches, and probably many other religious places, they tend to be heavily populated by older people. The Buddha was making this insight. He was saying this insight in the suttas even 2,600 years ago. And he said, do not wait until you're old to practice, because then in many ways it will be too late. Of course, it's never too late, but it is quite hard when you're older and set in your ways and don't have the ability to patiently endure very well and practice strongly. So that's why the Buddha encourages us to start the practice as young as possible, to really start to develop the mindset of investigating to see things as they are. Yata Bhuta, to see things as they are. So naturally, if the Buddha wants us to investigate that everything is impermanent, well, death is one of the most important things to investigate. In the Pabbatoppama Sutta, the simile of the mountains, the Buddha is speaking with the king. And he says to the king, great king, suppose that your scouts were to come back to you from all four directions, and they all reported that there's mountains as tall as the sky coming in, crushing everything in their wake. What would you do, great king? And the king didn't think very long before he said, if this was such a case, such a terrible loss of human life and destruction, what can one do but practice Dhamma and do good deeds? And so the Buddha says, I exhort you, great king, I tell you, old age, sickness, and death are coming in like mountains as tall as the sky, crushing everything in their wake. What is there to do? And the king repeats again, practice Dhamma, do good deeds. So knowing that everything is impermanent, knowing that the divine messengers are always there, and that the mountains are closing in, what is there to do? Practice Dhamma. And part of practicing Dhamma is bravely and courageously facing things that we don't want to face. Normally, we might put our heads in the sand, avoid, push back. But we want to practice our patient endurance and be able to face these things that the average person is afraid of and would rather not think about, rather not deal with. This is very common. You can think about in your own life. You can even think about in your own mind these reflections. Think about, oh, I might die. And then what arises in your mind? Oh, later. Or maybe fear. And so it's important to face the realities of life straightforward. Understand, to see the divine messengers. Don't live oblivious to them. To understand them very well. And then you can live mindfully, live well, practice good Dhamma, and do good deeds. And when the mountains close in, well, you live the best Dhamma life you could. And those good deeds will reap future good results of your good karma. So this is why the Buddha wants us to reflect and to understand something like mindfulness of death. And some of you, when you think about mindfulness of death, you might think of grossing yourself out with body parts or reflecting on the decay of corpses and things like that. And those are all part of this. That's true. But that's not the totality of it. There's a very simple, basic place that the Buddha wants us to start. And even just doing this reflection can be too much for some people. This is I'll type the link in the chat so that you can have it. This is Bhikkhu Bodhi translates it as themes. Bhante Sujato's it's 5 subjects for regular reviewing. This is something to keep, maybe even print out the first part and put it up and reflect on every day. So the Buddha says, there are 5 things that one should reflect upon often, whether you're a woman or a man, lay or ordained. So right here, the Buddha is, there's nobody else. There's no exemptions here. Right? The Buddha is not saying that 5 things that monks should reflect on. which is often an excuse. Some people say, oh, well, he's talking to bhikkhus. This is only for monks. Not, this one, he's directly saying, right, essentially the fourfold assembly. But this is everybody. What are the five? I'm subject to old age and decay. I've not gone beyond old age and decay. I'm subject to illness and disease. I've not gone beyond illness and disease. If you were reflecting on that regularly, and then when COVID hit, you'd be like, oh yeah, of course, I'm subject to illness and disease. This is what always comes up in life. So you practice that very strongly, and then the next COVID or whatever comes up, you're like, yep, I'm subject to illness and disease. And you don't freak out and worry about, oh, I might die, all these things. Nope. Yeah, this is what happens. This is normal. And the third thing, I'm subject to death. I'm not exempt from death. I've not gone beyond it. There's your divine messengers right there. So this is a regular reflecting, and that's all it is. It's just a reflecting. I'm subject to old age. I'm subject to illness. I'm subject to death. I can remember at Bhavana, in my early years at Bhavana, maybe I was Anagarika at the time, maybe a Samanera. And by that point, I had already been doing this practice for maybe 6 years, maybe 7 years by that point. And I was standing in front of the skeleton, the skeleton that's hanging in the front of the meditation hall, like I would do every day. And I do my mindfulness of death practices, and I'd be reflecting. I'm subject to old age. I'm subject to, and what I saw was my mind. I lost mindfulness just for a split second. So I'm like, I'm subject to illness. I'm not exempt from illness. And I watched my mind say this: I'm subject to death. I'm exempt from death. And I laughed and I realized, you stupid. How many years have you been doing this practice? And it still came out. You still think you're exempt from death. There's still a part of me that doesn't think that they're going to get old. I can see because especially when I think about, the ideas that I have of starting my own monastery and things like that, when I view myself in that position, I'm me now, but I'm going to be like 60 years old. I'm going to be old when many of these things, but I still think of myself right now. Even after all these years of practice, I still have these delusions. But this is the nature of it. They're so ingrained, so hard to really understand that even after many, many years of practice, you can still fall for some deluded thinking. This is what we're working with, why we have to keep reflecting so much. I'm subject to old age. I'm subject to illness. I'm subject to death. And then probably the one that scares people the most. I will be separated from everyone and everything I hold dear. Because just not you are subject to old age, sickness, and death. Every being is subject to old age, sickness, and death. Not even living beings. Even things like stars and planets. And maybe even the universe itself. Let alone you. Right? You will be separated from everyone and everything you hold dear. One of the things both of my parents are still alive, although it is, they're in their mid 70s, so it's getting close to the end. But growing up, I always remember they would say to each other, I hope I die first so I don't have to experience you dying, so I don't have to experience the loss. And as I got older, at first I was like, oh, that's so romantic, whatever. And then I got older, I was like, Yeah, that's typical delusion. We don't want to experience, we'd rather die than experience loss. But this is the nature of the mind. This is how it goes. But we will be separated from everybody. Tomorrow or 50 years from now. That's how it goes. So we need to be reflecting on this. And then the fifth one is, I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions. My actions are my relative. My actions are my resort. Whatever I do for good or evil, to that I shall be the heir. So again, this is pointing back to the simile of the mountains. Knowing that you're going to grow old, you're going to get sick, you're going to die, you're going to be separated from everybody you love. How do you act? Because you're responsible for your actions. How do you act? That's what the Buddha is telling us to reflect. How do you act? Because you're responsible for your actions. Well, the king gave the answer, right? The easy answer. The king gave it. Practice Dhamma, do good deeds. But there's even more to that. Knowing that you're going to be separated from everybody you love. Well, do you take them for granted? Do you hold grudges? Right? All unskillful ways that we engage with people that are in our lives. You really reflect on that. Why am I doing this? What's the point? We don't have all, eternity for this. Why am I holding on to these grudges? Why don't I mend these relationships? Right? Why don't I let go? These are very positive, wise side effects that arise from these reflections. And so if you, at least once a day, I would say maybe once an hour, and still that would still not be, the Buddha would still call that lazy. But if you can reflect on this at least once a day, I'm subject to old age, I'm subject to illness, I'm subject to death, then that is the very beginnings of mindfulness of death practices. You are reflecting at least once a day that, yeah, you could die. And so there's, in the Anguttara Nikaya, there is 2 suttas, Mindfulness of Death 1, Mindfulness of Death 2. In the first Mindfulness of Death sutta, the Buddha says, and I'll link that, just so that those of you who would like to have it. In Mindfulness of Death 1, there's a funny interaction, because the Buddha says, bhikkhus. I don't think that that's an excuse that just means monks. This is bhikkhus. Develop mindfulness of death. Developing mindfulness of death is of great fruit and great benefit. It leads to the deathless, to awakening, to nibbana. And so a monk kind of raises their hands like, I practice mindfulness of death. And the Buddha says, how do you practice mindfulness of death? And he says, I reflect, for a day and a night, I reflect, if I were to follow the Buddha's teachings, that would be of my great fruit and benefit. And then another one raises their hand, Bhante, how do you practice mindfulness of death? I practice, if only for a single day or a single night. If I were to follow the Buddhist teachings, how I would be of benefit. And then another monastic raises, obviously it doesn't say they raise their hand. But you like think about like when I read the sutta, it reminds me of like these like, you know, kids in a classroom and they're just trying to like outdo each other, raising their hand. Another monk says, half a day. And then another monk says, you know, a couple hours. Then another monk says, the time it takes to eat a meal. Then another monk says the time it takes to have a few bites. And then the last two monks say the time it takes to have one morsel of food and the time it takes to breathe in having breathed out. So half the breathing process in one small bit of eating. And the Buddha says, okay, monks, the monks who practice mindfulness of death for the time it takes to breathe in having breathed out or to have one morsel of eating, they're practicing diligently. Everybody else is practicing negligently, lazily, right? So according to the Buddha, if you're not reflecting on mindfulness of death, you know, every couple seconds maybe, you're being lazy. Hard thing to do, even for monastics, to keep it that close. But the Buddha, that's the Buddha setting a high bar like he does all the time. The Buddha sets a high bar for us to try to work up to. And in Mindfulness of Death 2, the Buddha gives us instructions. Actually, let me post that one. In Mindfulness of Death 2, the Buddha says, this is how one practices mindfulness of death. When waking up in the morning, they reflect, there are many ways I might die today. And it goes through a whole big paragraph of lists. Scorpions, snakes, bad food, heart attack, you know, all kinds of medical issues, getting killed, murder, eaten by animals, whatever, all kinds of maybe 20 different ways you can die. Now, of course, in the modern age, you can add more to that. You can say, I can get hit by a car, could be in a car accident, a meteor could come from the sky and hit me in the head. All kinds of ways you can die. And so then the Buddha says, and when the night comes and you go to bed, you reflect, there are many ways I could die tonight, and the same list. So twice a day, the Buddha is saying to reflect on many different ways that you could die in the coming time. Can you do that? It kind of, growing up Catholic, it vaguely is a reminder to me of a little prayer that kids would have where, you know, when you go to bed. Now I lay me down to sleep, pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, pray the Lord my soul to take. All right. So as a kid, it's like you're reflecting, I could die tonight. So hopefully I, you know, go to heaven maybe. But this is a reflection of, yeah, I might not wake up. I could go to bed and I might not wake up. I mean, of all the ways you could die, that's probably one of the nicest. Just go to bed and not wake up. But it's possible. So you do that reflection. And so the Buddha says, and when one does this reflection, so it's not just like, you know, for morbid curiosity, it's not to like scare you. The Buddha says, when one does this reflection, then you reflect. Are there any unskillful mind states, qualities that I have that if I died would lead to bad destinations? And if so, then one should practice like their head's on fire to abandon these. So the mindfulness of death is to reflect, I'm not awakened yet. I have lots of defilements. It's a crapshoot as to where I'm going to be in my next life. Maybe I should practice as much as I can to abandon as many defilements and bad habits now in this life while I have this chance. Practice like your head's on fire. In my community that I help run in Discord community, Magaseka community, I post 4 things every day, 4 little icons. And we've talked about 2 of them. First is I post the mountain, and then the second I post the fire. The Buddha is telling us to live like the mountains are closing in and practice like our head's on fire. This is how one should live. Not easy things to do, but this is the Buddha telling us how we should live, how we should practice. So these are why we should practice mindfulness of death. Reflecting on these things. Reflecting on that this body will fall apart. It won't be as reliable as it was. One day this body is going to be bereft of life. The Buddha says, like a useless tree stump. It's quite different than how we treat bodies when our loved ones die, right? The coroner with the the funeral home director makes the body nice and dresses up nice, and we put it in it. We try to get the best coffin because we think that's going to keep the body from doing what nature does, and it might keep them for a little while, but nature always finds a way. As the one guy said in that one movie a long time ago, nature always finds a way. But we don't want to think about the body decaying. We don't want to reflect on what this body is. And that's what Asubha practice is. Reflecting on what this body is. Asubha, sometimes people translate it as repulsiveness. And that's not really a great translation for this. Subha means beautiful. Asubha means not beautiful. The Buddha tells us we have an intoxication with health, an intoxication with youth, an intoxication with life. We have an intoxication with our body and the bodies of others. And so the Buddha wants to, when we practice, this is from Satipatthana Sutta under the body section, practicing Patikula Manasikara. Manasikara is to consider, to contemplate. Patikula can mean repulsive, but also can mean the opposite. So the Buddha is coming from the basis of we're really intoxicated with our bodies and other people's bodies. How about you practice considering the opposite? All right, so it's like a scale, and we really like our bodies and the bodies of others, and the Buddha wants us to reflect consider the opposite, so we come to a balanced understanding of what this body is. So this is where the 32 parts of the body come in, reflecting on all the different parts of the body. Head hair, body hair, nails, teeth, skin. Kesa, loma, naka, danta, tacho. It's one of the 5. These are the 5 meditate. Oh, that's right. I remembered that you like to take out the computers. I forgot about that. The monastery cat is here, and I think he was looking to see if he could take out the live stream. He doesn't want to think about mindfulness of death. And then head hair, body hair, nails, teeth, skin, bones, sinew, liver, all the different parts of the body. We're not reflecting that on those things to gross ourselves out. We're reflecting on them to understand what this body is. And the Buddha gives a simile that perfectly that kind of helps us to set the right tone for this practice. The simile is, it's as if a man with good sight were to have a bag, and in that bag was hill rice and red rice and this bean and that bean, etc. And he were to put a hand in the bag and pick out, oh, this is hill rice, this is mung bean, this is red rice, whatever. And he would know it just like that. This is how, this is the bot, this is the skin, this is the nails, this is the tongue, or whatever, etc. So when you see that, the question is then, well, what's missing? This is hill rice. Oh, I like hill rice. This is mung beans. Oh, I hate mung beans. This is this. Oh, I like this. This is that. I hate this. What's missing is like and dislike. There's not supposed to be disgustingness that arises when you reflect on this. You're reflecting simply on the nature of this body, what this body is. This is understanding things as they are. Now, when you first start doing these mindfulness of death practices, fear will probably arise. Disgust will probably arise. This is normal. And the reason why these things are arising is because you've never reflected on these things in depth before. So in the beginning, there will be lots of fear. In the beginning, there will be maybe some disgust. But as you keep reflecting and developing your wisdom and insight into these practices, that will go away. And it'll be replaced by wisdom and insight and peace, contentment. At first, though, you're going to have that fear and that maybe a little disgust, because you haven't practiced, you haven't reflected on these things. You've been like everybody else in the world, avoiding, ignoring, pretending. But now you're bravely facing reality. Reality's not pretty. Reality is, we think it's otherwise, but we want to know and understand things as they are. And then the probably the most advanced practice is the charnel ground contemplations. You can find this also in Satipatthana Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 10. And in this, you reflect, you do visualizations of, it is as if the body, a dead body is on the ground. And then it goes through some pretty graphic things. Like if you've ever actually, watched a body decompose, it's not pretty. And so you're reflecting on the different stages of the decomposition and things like that. I'm a little jealous because I hear in Buddhist countries, sometimes Buddhist monks can do that. You can go hang out with the body and watch the decay process. I don't think you're allowed to do that in America. So I've never been able to do it, although I have been around many people who have died. But this practice, again, might bring up fear and disgust, but really it's to reflect on, this is the nature of what happens with the body when there is no life essence there, when there's no more existence, when the being has gone on, the mind has gone on to the next life, the body is just like a useless tree stump. And it just goes according to its nature. Nothing to be fearful or disgusted about that. It's just the way it is. So this is the proper mindset. We're doing these practices to be able to understand things as they are, to understand the nature of this mind and body very deeply, to know the process, the rise and fall, right? This body and this being in this lifetime have come to be. First, they were little cells, and then baby, and the baby's born, and then you grow older, you get taller, and you get, health, strong, big, and then you start to get older, and you start to get hunched over, and you get weak, and your eyesight's not as good, and then you die. The rise and fall of things. That's one of the things that the Buddha wants us to investigate in our mindfulness practice. How things arise, persist for a time, and then cease. This is the nature of reality. So these practices require you to have a little courage, right? A little patient endurance to contemplate things that the average person doesn't want to contemplate, because it's not easy to do that. But the benefits are quite powerful. Not only in terms of wisdom and insight, but you know how to act skillfully in these situations. Your parents die or somebody dies and everybody's a wreck. And you are too. But you've practiced this and you understand this is the nature of things. You're not so much of a wreck that you are unable to make the plans with the funeral home and do all yada, 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 and be a support to others. Right? This is a benefit as well, a very practical benefit in this life that can be of benefit to yourself and others. Right? Everybody else is falling apart around you, and you're suffering because if you have an attachment, and that attachment is broken, you will suffer. But because of your wisdom and insight, you're able to be more skillful about it. That's a very powerful side effect. So I think I'm good. We've been going for about 50 minutes or so. I think that's enough to talk about these mindfulness of death practices. I highly encourage you all at least to practice the reflections, the 5 contemplations. If that's all you do, that will be already very powerful. Just reminding yourself every day, you're going to grow old, you're going to get sick, you're going to die. Making it not philosophical or what's the word, sometime in the future, but bringing it to the present and reminding yourself of these facts of life, this nature of reality, and you will reap great benefits from doing so. as the Buddha tells us. All right, friends. So that's it for the talk. Now it's time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions about the topic, questions about Buddhism in general, meditation in general, about monastics, you're welcome to ask those questions. Just check the chat. Let's see. Welcome, Suzanne. Oh, no, I said that. Welcome, John, Jun, Bhumika, Jayantha. Sri Devi, VL, Sister Sunny, Sud. All right, let's see one or two questions. Oh, Louisa makes a comment at least. I try to remind myself when I see an elderly person that will be me one day. Yeah. Yes. That's very important to do that. And that also can reflect on you're like, okay, well, that will be me one day. How would I want to be treated? And how do I treat older people? And how would I want to be treated when I'm at the end of my life and need support? Can't do everything independently like I used to be able to do, these kind of things. It's very important. It's good to, one of the reflections I learned this from a fellow Dhamma practitioner, this woman that I met and this is this is like, maybe like 13 years ago when I first started going to Bhavana as a layperson. And I remember I was talking to this woman and she told me, she said that she learned this from Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Ajahn Jeff. And I never could confirm it, but I've kept it because it's a really interesting practice. And she said that you do a visualization, a reflection, like you close your eyes and you visualize yourself in front of you. And then you make that visualization grow old. And you watch it grow old, the graying hair, whatever, and then eventually falls over and dies. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting practice because I like visualizations. It's a a large part of my practice. And so I started doing it. I was like, oh, this is great stuff. So I just kind of visualized myself getting older and kind of just like, hunching over and then falling over dead. Yeah. And so I think that's a really cool, like if you're into doing, visualizations, that's a really kind of good way to reflect on yourself as older. Now, these days on the internet, they have these easy things where it's like make myself, even phone apps, make myself look old. You have a picture of yourself and it makes you look old. Then you can use those and you can, maybe that's not exactly how you will look, but maybe it might be close, so make yourself old in a phone app and you can keep that picture and look at it. It's like, yep, that's going to be me. Sud says, Dear Bhante, what should one do if let's say you do this practice, but fear of ghosts and things like that arises? That's interesting. Why would fear of ghosts arise? Like maybe you feel like you're thinking about it and that is like bad luck for ghosts to arises. I don't know. If you're doing these practices and you start to fear petas and things like that, well, you reflect on that is one type of life in the samsaric state, and you were petas before, and you could be petas again. Right? This is just another way of existence in the samsaric state. You just reflect on that, reflect on that. What are these ghosts? Why are they ghosts? You reflect on that. It's not good karma to become petas, right? That is considered one of the woeful states. So you can reflect on why, that you want to develop good karma. And then you can also maybe even, if the ghost, if that kind of really invades your mind, practice metta. Give metta to the petas. Say, may you be born in a good place as a human to hear the Dhamma and practice well. Metta is actually something that goes really good with mindfulness of death practices. Like how I mentioned before, how I would do the practice in front of the skeleton. I would do my mindfulness of death practices. And as I reflected not only myself, but others, then I would start giving metta out. Because it really really reflecting on that, like we're all in this boat, we're all going to get sick. We're all going to get old. We're all going to die. That actually can bring up lots of good metta, lots of goodwill for all beings. And so practicing both is kind of like, it's a good way to balance it out. If you're practicing mindfulness of death practice and it feels a little bit too much, you could practice metta to balance it out. So those are two practices I think that go quite well together. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. I'll give it another minute or so. And then if there's nothing, we'll call it a night. Oh.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What was the fourth and the fifth thing we should reflect on?
That you're going to be four is you're going to be separated from everything and everyone you hold dear. And then 5 is that you're the owner of your actions, owner of your karma.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you practice the mindfulness? Mindfulness.
How I practice mindfulness. Well, the Buddha gives us the way to do this in the Satipatthana Sutta. This is foundations of mindfulness. So the foundations of mindfulness, so 4 aspects of our experience that we should investigate, that we should try to look at and to see. So related to our body, right? You're reflecting on trying to understand what this body is. And related to the feeling in the body. So you have a painful feeling. And so to be mindful of that is to really try to understand what that painful feeling is in the body, right? To what that painful feeling, does to the mind, the thoughts and the impulses that arise for that painful feeling. So you're trying to, like a detective investigating a case or a scientist looking at something through the microscope, you're trying to understand your experience in a very deep way, right? This is called pajanati, is to know very well, to know deeply. And so this is a mindset that we have to develop, because it's very easy to not be mindful. You have to practice and develop like a habit, like you're going to learn how to play the piano or sew or whatever thing that you want to develop a habit in. You have to develop the habit to be mindful, and then it becomes a tool for you to understand your experience in a very deep way. Right? And because when you understand that experience, then that's when wisdom and insight arises. So that's how you start mindfulness. You can start out by just trying to understand very basic things like the feeling in the body, the state of your mind, the thoughts that arise, these kind of things.
How come pain like
Yeah.
Like this? How come pain? What happened pain?
Mm-hmm.
Like this I can understand.
Yeah.
Like example, can you give me example like this?
Oh, okay. Well, another example besides pain is like anger arises in your mind, and you try to see, why did the anger arise? Is that anger justified or not? What should I when I act out of anger? Is that a skillful thing? Does that help myself and others, or does it harm myself and others? So you're reflecting on what arises and how you act, and how that action is skillful or unskillful. So
But searching the word, searching something.
yeah.
What happened? How come? What's going on?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we are good for the night then. Okay, friends. Suki Hotu, may you be well and at ease, practice well and be well. May you have a spiritually successful and peaceful practice until we meet again, which, if I'm alive, should be tomorrow night. So Bhante Siddhasa will be here if he's alive. Bhante Siddhasa will be here tomorrow morning for the normal morning sutta readings. And if I'm alive tomorrow night, well, I'll be back for another evening. I don't know what the topic will be yet, but we'll figure it out. So have a good night. And may you wake up in the morning.